Today we move to the third unit of our conversation. I told you nervous system is going to be the biggest part of all the material in this two classes, AP1 and AP2. Nervous system takes up 3 units, okay? And we're going to start talking about peripheral nervous system today. As we discussed before, generally functional nervous system, and anatomically as well, can be separated into the central and probably bigger and more diverse peripheral. While central nervous system consists of the brain stem, and the spinal cord, peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves, cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and various types of receptors. Okay? The function of the peripheral nervous system is the communication, essentially, delivering sensory inputs to the CNS and transmitting the motor controlling commands to the effectors of the nervous system. The effectors of the nervous system, there are just two. It's muscles and glands, and that's it. If you think about it, turns out every response that your body can produce in response when it is stimulated turns out to be a response mediated by muscles or glands. For example, when you are sweating, it's a response mediated by the sweat glands. When you're moving, it's the response mediated by the skeletal glands. When your heart rate increases after you are excited or scared, it's a response mediated by cardiac muscle. Does that make sense? So those are only 2 types of effectors. Now, skeletal muscles are under control of somatic nervous system, okay, somatic nerves, while the smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands, all controls that are subconscious or unconscious, okay, are under control of autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means that it functions by itself without any conscious input from your side. Autonomic nervous system is responsible for all your visceral functions, visceral controls. Autonomic nervous system, and I want to highlight this, that somatic and autonomic branches belong to the motor division. Okay, so when we say somatic branch, we mean it's a motor control of the muscles. When we say visceral branch or autonomic branch, we mean autonomic control of the glands and cardiac and smooth muscles. Autonomic nervous system can be divided into sympathetic, which is responsible for mobilization of your organism, and parasympathetic, which function is to conserve the energy. So for instance, when you are sleeping or relaxed, or you just had a meal, okay, and you sit on the couch and you're watching TV, you are conserving energy, and that's the moment when your parasympathetic system is active and your sympathetic system is inhibited. But if you are exercising or you scared or in any way excited, positively or negatively stressed, your sympathetic system is activated. The resources of your body being mobilized at this moment. Now, we talk a lot about motor controls, but sensory controls are no less important. Think about this. Your body constantly receives enormous amount of sensory input conveyed via sensory receptors in your skin, your muscles, and your joints, your tendons, and of course organs of special senses like eyes, ears, tongue, and nose. What would happen if you would be deprived of all those sensations? Have you heard about sensory deprivation tank? So pretty much you are suspended of sorts in the salt solution, which allows you to float, but you are practically all your body except for the face is surrounded by that salt solution. Its temperature is exactly the temperature of your body. The tank is completely dark and there is no sound that gets in there unless you decide to try and taste the salt solution. So if you lie calmly in that salt solution, then in a certain amount of time you will have practically no sensations coming through the sensory receptors. This is called sensory deprivation, and your central nervous system will start to generate sensations of its own. Essentially, it will start to create sensory hallucinations. Yes. Yes. It's called sensory deprivation tank. I think it is used to treat certain neuropsychiatric disorders.
What's the reason behind the hallucinations or whatever? Like the system creating its own senses?
Well, I'm not familiar with scientific studies on the molecular level, but from sort of a common sense physiology, abrupt, when you normally have sensory inputs and then you abruptly don't have them, system fills the void. Okay. It tries to fill the void based on your previous experiences and creates those hallucinations. Now, the main component of peripheral nervous system is nerve. Okay, a nerve, not the nerve, a nerve. Nerves essentially are humongous bunches of axons, various neurons. Okay, and nerves can be quite long, as you can imagine. We had a discussion about, for instance, motor neurons. Remember we talked about the pyramidal tracts that consist of upper and lower motor neurons, how upper motor neurons originate in, say, primary motor cortex, and then they extend downstream, they descend into the spinal cord and synapse with lower motor neurons in the ventral horns of the spinal cord. That's a pretty long way to go. And then lower motor neurons can extend the axons all the way from the spinal cords to the muscles that they innervate. And that becomes also, they can be like a foot long or something like that. Does that make sense? So each axon inside of the neuron, you can see the axon right here, is surrounded by the thin layer of the loose connective tissue that is called endoneurium. Endo, inside. You have to understand that endoneurium is not a membrane. So you have axon, which has membrane and the layer of myelin, right? And superficial to that myelin layer is endoneurium. So each axon is carefully wrapped into the loose connective tissue. Then a bunch of axons form fascicle. You can see a single fascicle on this picture right here. Each fascicle is surrounded by the connective tissue, layer of connective tissue called perineurium. From Latin, fascicle or fascia is it's a bunch, bundle. And by the way, the word fascist comes from the same origin, the initial symbol for Italian fascists was the bunch of sticks, according to the old saying that, you can break one, but you cannot break a bunch when they're all together. Okay, so those words are of the same origin. That's This Week in English. And a bunch of several fascicles form a nerve. Okay? This bunch of fascicles is surrounded by epineurium. So essentially the whole nerve is surrounded by the connective tissue called epineurium. So in this electron micrograph of the nerve cross-section, you can see individual axons surrounded by endoneurium, perineuria that surround fascicles, and that outside layer is epineurium. At the center of the nerve are the blood vessels, because axons need oxygen and nutrients. What's up? Here? The most outside layer is epineurium. Epineurium. So you go from epineurium, which is the most outside right here, to the perineurum, which surrounds each fascicle, the white lines on the left micrograph. Okay? And then to endoneurium, which surrounds each axon. Is that clear? Now, terminology-wise, you have to be comfortable and familiar by this point with the terms afferent and efferent. Afferent means sensory, and efferent means motor. Okay? Fibers can be fibers, or should I say, yes, fibers or axons, should I say neurons. Neuron can be only motor or only sensory. Can you explain why a given neuron can be only motor or only sensory? Why neuron cannot be both? Why neuron cannot be both motor and sensory?
Because of its structure and location in a way, it can't travel and therefore do more than one thing. It has to specialize.
Technically speaking, both motor and sensory, in a second, both motor and sensory impulses are just electric impulses. Why it cannot transmit both?
Depending on the transmission, when you have the neuron sending the signal through the synapse, it's a chemical.
Okay, exactly. Synaptic chemical synapse works only in one way. Does that make sense? So, motor neurons can only transmit signals to the muscles, to the effectors, muscles, glands, whatever. Sensory neurons will only transmit signals from the body periphery to the CNS. It cannot go both ways. Does it make sense? Now, here we speaking about neurons. Okay? And you may have a bundle of neurons. You may have a fascicle that is motor or sensory, but in a single nerve, you may have fibers that are, some fibers can be sensory, some fibers can be sensory, whereas in mixed nerves. Okay. Some fibers can be sensory, some fibers can be motor. Does that make sense? For example, there are not so many highways that go only in one direction. Does that make sense? Normally you have a highway with, I don't know, westbound and eastbound, northbound and southbound. Same goes for nerves. Nerves have both afferent and efferent. Both afferent and efferent fibers. They're different, like lanes on a highway. Okay? But they all are in the same nerve. For instance, femoral nerve, okay? It innervates mostly the anterior surface of your thigh, so it's muscle control, okay? And it also delivers the sensory input, somatic sensations, from the anterior surface of your thigh. Does that make sense? Okay? So the nerve contains fibers. Some fibers deliver motor information to the skeletal muscle. Some fibers deliver sensory information from that skeletal muscle. Those are two different fibers. Okay? So based on the quality of the fiber, each fiber can be somatic or visceral, depending on where does it go, okay, and afferent or efferent. For instance, the fiber that controls the contraction of a skeletal muscle will be somatic efferent. Fiber that controls the secretion from the stomach will be visceral efferent. Okay? Does that make sense? So fibers can be somatic or visceral, afferent or efferent, and those two terms can be combined. Is that clear? Now, nerves, anatomically. Questions?
You said somatic. For muscle contractions, it would be somatic efferent, and then for visceral.
For visceral controls, like visceral efferent, yes. For sensations, same, if it goes from, if it's somatic sensations, it's going to be somatic afferent. If it's visceral sensations, it's visceral afferent. Okay. Now, anatomically, nerves can be divided into the cranial and spinal. Cranial nerves originate in the brain and brain stem. Okay. Diencephalon and brain stem, let's say. Spinal nerves originate in the spinal cord. That's it. Now, remember we talked about gray matter versus white matter. So gray matter contains which part of the neuron? Bodies. Okay, so bodies of the neurons that comprise nerves can be found in the nuclei in the central nervous system. For instance, nuclei in the brain stem, or nuclei, horns in the spinal cord, nuclei in the spinal cord. Or bodies can be found in the ganglia, in the peripheral nervous system. So it's sort of a strict separation. If somebody says superior mesenteric ganglion, ganglia is plural, ganglion is singular. If somebody tells you, this neuron originates, its body is in superior mesenteric ganglion, it means that ganglion is in the periphery. It's not a part of CNS. It's part of peripheral nervous system. Does that make sense? Very important feature of the neurons in the peripheral nervous system is that they can regenerate. They can regrow. Okay? Did you ever have deep cut? Any sort of injury that was kind of significant? Deep penetrating wound. Okay? If you had this, you can appreciate probably there were some axons severed. on the way of whatever did that. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? Axon is severed. What happens is that ends of the severed axon, okay, they will start to swell and they will seal themselves. And then, here, the site of the damage, the process called Wallerian degeneration starts, which pretty much means the part of the axon that was cut off, it completely disassembles. Does that make sense? So the part that was cut off disassembles. During the Wallerian degeneration and the disassembly, another thing, macrophages, they migrate to the site of the injury and clean out the debris, okay, of that severed axon. They don't touch myelin sheath though. You can see that myelin sheath remains more or less whole, more or less intact, okay? And then Schwann cells that in periphery, sorry about that brain freeze. In periphery, so Schwann cells, remember, they provide myelin sheath for electrical insulation. Schwann cells start to proliferate. Can you remind me what the term proliferation means? Multiply. They start to multiply. They multiply, grow, migrate into the site of injury, and form so-called regeneration tube. Okay? You can see that regeneration tube here. And then on the sort of inner surface of the Schwann cells here, okay, on the inner surface, so-called cell adhesion molecules are expressed. Cell adhesion molecules work like sort of a breadcrumbs for the axon. They guide the axonal regrowth. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm saying? You don't just have a tube. So you have a tube with the molecules sticking out of the membrane of Schwann cells inside of the tube that guide the regrowth of axon. Do you see what I'm saying? So, cell adhesion molecules, they act sort of like breadcrumbs, guiding axonal regrowth inside of the regeneration tube. It regrows pretty fast, 1.5 millimeters a day. Okay? Now, here's an interesting thing about axonal regrowth. The path that newly formed axon takes when it grows doesn't match the original path. We don't know. That just, probably because it's really different conditions for development. So, using the same analogy with the road, imagine that you used to have a road that goes through several towns. Okay, say from Kirtland through Eastlake, Willoughby, and I don't know, to Cleveland. Okay, and then for some reason this road was completely destroyed, and you start building the new one. You have a general idea where to go because you have those towns on the way, but the new road that you're going to build is probably not going to be exactly as the old one. You don't have any maps or anything remain. Okay, does that make sense? And that has very interesting clinical implication. You may have heard about stories, real clinical stories, when people got their limbs reattached. When I was a kid, I was positively shocked by the story. It was pretty famous when a little girl decided to pull her favorite dress out of the washing machine. It was old style washing machine that didn't stop when you open it. So she opened it and decided to pull the dress out of the rotating drum. Well, in the fight between the washing machine and the girl, washing machine won and ripped the girl's hands from the shoulders. She had a badass grandmother who noticed it, turned off the washing machine, patted wounds, grabbed the hands, put them on ice, and brought the girl to the hospital. That was pretty badass grandmother. And it was like really a big, good hospital. And the girl was immediately brought to the OR, and they managed to reattach the hands back. And they became fully functional, but after a time, because when, well, everything grew back normally, okay, but neurons, the nerves, didn't grow exactly as they used to be. So she pretty much had to learn to use her hands again. You see what I'm trying to say? Because path to the skeletal muscles and innervation of skeletal muscles became different. But that's possible. With the peripheral damage, it's possible. The only problem, though, if the body of the neuron gets destroyed, you have to understand that. If the body of the neuron gets destroyed, then you boned. So we discussed polio last week, right? During poliomyelitis, the bodies of motor neurons in the ventral horns are destroyed. That's it. Body is gone. Axon can regrow. Body can't. Does it make sense? Okay? Now, you may ask why CNS fibers don't regenerate. We don't know exactly, but it turns out there's some proteins, probably, that inhibit the regrowth of oligodendrocytes and consequently inhibit the regrowth of axons in the nervous system. Oligodendrocytes cannot form proper regeneration tube, no regeneration. Okay. Now the problem, if there's a damage in the CNS, like in the spinal cord or in the brain, there's an inflammation. And inflammation leads to the formation of scar tissue. Scar tissue is not a nervous tissue. Those astrocytes, when they form scar tissue, they, prevent the regrowth. Go ahead.
Just kind of related to the forming of scar tissue and the inflammation here, when one of those nerves, when it is severed, essentially, when it comes down to inflammation, is that the body's way of trying to add the pressure to push these ends or anything?
No, I don't think so, because it's not like you split the things and then fuse them back together. You split the thing, and whatever was cut off degenerates completely. Like in the lizard, when you pull the tail regrows from scratch. It's not like lizard finds the old tail and sticks it back and tries to fuse, the old tail with the butt. Okay? So it's just growing the new one. It's pretty much the same here. We're growing the new part of the axon. Does that make sense? So, anatomically, know the structure of nerve. Sorry. 3 layers of connective tissue, endo-peri-epineurium. What is fascicle? Types of neurons and what type of signal they transmit. Afferent versus efferent, visceral versus somatic. Understanding of mixed nerve versus motor nerve versus sensory nerve. Nuclei versus ganglia. What's in there and where you can find nuclei, where can you find ganglia? Understand the process of the axonal regeneration in the PNS. Okay? Clear? Cranial nerves. I will be very clear on what you have to know. You have to know anatomically 12 cranial nerves and their location on this picture. Are we good? So then I will tell you how to approach this memorization. It's easier than you may think. Okay? I promise I will show you this picture without labels, and you will have to identify the nerves. Okay? Numbers from 1 to 12. nerves are numbered from the ventral to the dorsal, okay, and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So pretty much you can do the tracing like that. Okay? How can you memorize the sequence? I got you a little mnemonic rule up there. There are many of them, at least half a dozen. On occasion, a trusty truck acts funny, very good vehicle anyhow. Okay? So you need to know nerves and the functions, whether they are sensory, motor. When we say motor, it means predominantly motor. When we say both, it means nerve has an important motor and sensory component. So some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter most. Okay, that's the functional mnemonic. Let me walk you through them, and we will talk about each individual nerve in a little bit more details. So we start with olfactory, which is entirely sensory nerve. Keep with optic, which is sensory. Continue with oculomotor, which is motor nerve. Okay. Trochlear, which is motor. Then really large trigeminal nerve, which is both motor and sensory. Keep with abducens, which is motor. Continue with facial, which is both. Then with vestibulocochlear, which is sensory. Then glossopharyngeal and vagus, which are both. And then accessory, motor, and hypoglossal motor. I'm going to give you, on Thursday, I'm going to give you a little paper chase in class. You'll just go through all the nerves, okay? And I promise I'll upload some labs also. Sorry. So we're going to talk about functions of each nerve as well. Now, another thing that you will absolutely see on the anatomy exam for this chapter, you're going to see pictures from each individual nerve. Does that make sense? You will see, for instance, the picture like that, and you will have to recognize, without labels, and you will have to recognize which nerve that is. Am I clear? So the first one is olfactory. Simple. Sensations of smell. Okay? So it runs all the way to the olfactory cortex. Okay? Interesting thing about olfactory nerve is that the branches, essentially the dendrites of the neurons, okay, they are in the nasal cavity where they sense the smell, and then they go through the roof of the nasal cavity right here to the olfactory bulb. Okay, that roof of the nasal cavity is called a cribriform plate. Okay, there are two implications to that. Implication number one, broken nose. If the blow in the nose is hard enough and breaks ethmoid bone, which cribriform plate is part of, then the person will lose the sense of smell due to the destruction of the nerve. Such condition is called anosmia. Another possible reason, another possible cause for anosmia is infection or inflammation of the nasal cavity. You know, when you have rhinitis, severe nasal infection, then you probably will not have the perfect sense of smell. Does that make sense? Another interesting implication of this anatomical structure, essentially, if you would look at the cribriform plate here, you will see a bunch of little tiny holes through which those neurons go into the olfactory bulb. So it provides something, it provides a passageway from the nasal cavity to the nerve, right, to the olfactory nerve, and then to the brain. You've heard about brain-eating amoeba, one of my favorite diseases. 3 to 5 cases in the United States every year. Usually happens in the South when people swim in warm ponds and lakes and then snort water, mostly kids. And amoeba that normally lives in water and soil, in this case water, it gets in the nose and inadvertently ends up in those holes in the cribriform plate. And it travels along the neurons to the olfactory bulb, along the olfactory nerve, to the cortex, and starts to eat the brain. Because there's nothing better to eat, you know. The disease is practically always fatal. There are like few cases when people got treated successfully, mostly because the diagnosis is done too late. The moment when the lab is confirmed, usually the patient dies. It's not frequent, but it's pretty tragic. So how can you identify the functionality of the olfactory nerve? You give someone to sniff any sort of a strong smell, okay? Vanilla, coffee, anything. Does that make sense? Question?
I noticed a couple places that sell fragrances, whether it's incense or oils, anything like that. Sometimes they have coffee beans for you to sniff, so that way you can reset, I guess, and smell other things. Why coffee beans?
Probably because it's I don't really know anything about fragrances like in industry. My guess would be you need any strong smell, because if you sniff a fragrance, eventually what your brain's going to do is going to perform habituation, right? The smell, it will start to filter it out because it's a strong sensory input that is a permanent input. Does that make sense? So in order to reset it, you need some other sensory input that will sort of wipe off the memory of the initial one. For instance, I can give an example. When I was a college student, I majored in chemistry. And we had a separate building for the School of Chemistry. I had few friends that were in the School of Math. And one day we set the meeting, so we needed a point to meet, and I told them, wait for me in the lobby of our building. And I go down and there's nobody there, so I walk out on the street and they're there and ask them, what's going on? Why are you not inside? They say, we cannot be there, it stinks. For them, it smelled awful. I didn't feel anything because I was there every day, for like third year of my life, and of course it all smelled normal. So that's habituation. I didn't feel it abnormal. Because people synthesize different kinds of crap. There was one part of the building where I didn't really dare to go. Yeah, people like sulfur organic chemicals. Yeah, people ride the subway alone. If you want to remove the smell from your hair, you shave. No, seriously, it smells like clothing. They had separate set of clothing because if you bring them home, the only thing you can do is just throw them away. I mean, when they say they ride subway alone, hobos leave. I'm not kidding, it's that bad. Sulfur organic is awful. Optic nerve, another example of completely sensory nerve, right? So you can see that the nerve fibers extend from the retina of each eye, okay, and they reach the point that is called optic chiasma. Chiasma in Greek means cross. It was the word specific to the wooden cross, okay? So we use chiasma as the name for cross. At optic chiasma, fibers split. Fibers from each eye, and if you'll take a closer look, you will notice it. For instance, on this image, you have like green fibers, right, and the maroon fibers. So maroon fibers from the right eye will go to the right hemisphere, while green fibers from the right eye will go to the left hemisphere. So sensory inputs from each eye will reach both hemispheres. And that crossover of fibers allows you to, first of all, don't completely lose the sight from both eyes if there's a damage, say here, okay? So still have input from both eyes. Does that make sense? It's going to be impaired, but you're still going to see with both eyes. Why it is important to see with both eyes? Why it's better to see with both eyes than with one? Depth perception, yes. Okay? With one eye you don't have really depth perception. Okay? So these parts are nerves. These parts are tracts. So before the chiasma, it's optic nerves. After the chiasma, it's optic tracts. Optic tracts enter thalamus, synapse and thalamus, and then this visual signal gets delivered to the visual cortices in occipital lobes. Okay. You can access you can see if the person has any visual problems by assessing the vision fields with the eye chart, and you can see test the peripheral vision. It will also tells you if the peripheral vision is impaired, then probably the optic tract is impaired because signals from different parts of retina will be blocked. Does that make sense? Also, the condition known as papilledema, which is the swelling of the optic nerve, can be detected with so-called fundal exam. You know, when you visit doctor, they turn on like the pen, sort of pen, and light in your eye and look there, okay? That's fundal exam. They look actually at the bottom of your eye to see if there is any damage to your optic nerve.
Why do they shoot like puffs of air in your eye?
I have no idea. Probably maybe to check if you blink properly, because nerve endings in the cornea will make you blinking. But that's the only reason I can think of right now. I don't know. I never experienced that. Now, the defects to the vision are called anopsia. Yep. Okay, and these defects may come from the damage to the nerve or to the tract. So as I mentioned, the damage to the nerve leads to complete blindness of one eye. So if there is a nerve damage, like right optic nerve, your right eye stops seeing. If there is a tract damage, say here, then you can appreciate that the signals from both the right and the left eye will reach a hemisphere. Does that make sense? See the difference between the tract and nerve damage? So tract is right here, right? So if you damage the tract, look at the fibers. Again, can you see the green one? Can you see the maroon one? They all here, they both form optic nerve. When they reach chiasma, maroon fibers go into the same hemisphere. Green fibers on that picture go into the different hemisphere. Is that understood? So, if you damage the nerve, signal from that eye stops, period. However, if you damage the tract, then signal from the right eye will reach left hemisphere, and signal from the left eye will also reach left hemisphere. So damage to the tract impairs your vision, but doesn't stop the signals from either of the eyes completely. Does it make sense? Good. Oculomotor nerve. So oculomotor. Ocular refers to the eye, motor refers to the movement. That's kind of self-explanatory. It's mostly motor. We're going to consider oculomotor nerve motor nerve. Okay, controls the extrinsic eye muscles. Actually, 4 of them. So it will be responsible for moving eye inward, upward, downward, and outside and up. Okay? So it controls 4 muscles, which are inferior oblique and 3 rectus muscles. Okay? So damage to this nerve will impair somebody's ability to voluntarily move the eye. It also controls levator palpebrae superioris, which raises the eyelid, and allows you to blink. And it also contains the parasympathetic fibers to the sphincter pupillae and ciliary muscle. So sphincter pupillae is the muscle of the iris that controls the size of the pupil. If it's stimulated, it constricts. If it's not stimulated, it doesn't constrict, so your iris stays dilated. Does that make sense? One of the responses, when they assess the brain damage, the nerve damage, they shine the light in your eye. If there is a damage to the oculomotor nerve or to the brain stem, it's the result of, say, a blow to the head. If there is no pupillary constriction, then it's either midbrain or the oculomotor nerve. Does that make sense? And also responsible for the lens accommodation, so you can close vision. Does that make sense? So you can see that it's chiefly a motor nerve. It controls a lot of muscles, both skeletal muscles like external intrinsic eye muscles and levator palpebrae superioris, and also controls smooth muscles, sphincter pupillae and ciliary. Does it convey any sensory information? What do you think?
Does it convey any
Sensory information. A little bit. Think about this. If you close your eyes and you will start moving your eyes, do you know which direction you are, quote unquote, looking? Right? That's proprioception from your extrinsic eye muscles. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? For instance, so I close my eyes now, okay? I know that I'm looking straight. Now I know that I turn my eyes to the left, to the right, up, down. To move my eyes, I use those extrinsic eye muscles. They contract. When they contract, they send a signal back to the brain that they contract. That's proprioception. Does that make sense? So that proprioception from extrinsic eye muscles is minimal, okay, but that's the part. The most common clinical examination is to examine the size of the pupil, as we just discussed, and also ability to follow objects, you know, like they do. This, and then this. The most common imbalance that you can find is the lazy eye, okay? It's called strabismus. When the nerve is paralyzed, most frequently the eye rolls laterally. Okay, it's called external strabismus. If the branch that innervates the eyelid is damaged, ptosis. That's the condition for the drooping eyelid. And also, people cannot focus on the close objects because contraction of the ciliary muscles is required for moving the focal point closer to you. Does that make sense? So you can assess person's ability to focus, you can assess person's ability to follow the moving objects and size of the pupil. Okay? We're going to start from this next time. We're going to call it a day. Your grades are going to be posted